Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Strong Towns webcast this week. Really excited to have everybody here. I do see some more people trickling in, so I'm going to wait like just one more minute and then we'll get started. Lisa is at the ready to give us a great presentation. We did put a poll question up, so if you look at there's a little icon that looks like a kind of a graphic chart. You'll see a poll. Welcome you to answer those poll questions. Basically, we want to know what your biggest challenge or problem is with civic engagement. We gave a few options that you can click on. We also have a question icon, so if you want to ask questions throughout the presentation, you can do that on there. And we will get started shortly here. Thank you. Oh, I want to mention one more thing too. In the chat area, I'm going to add. There's a couple quick little troubleshooting tips too. Just for people, but basically, some of the big ones is if the screen is blurry, there's a gear icon in the bottom right of the video screen, and if you click on that and switch to HD, that generally works. The other thing that I've noticed too for people is if you refresh your screen, that can help. Okay. I tell you what, it looks like we've kind of gone down to a trickle of people coming in. So let's go ahead and get started. First of all, I want to thank. We've been doing these member webcasts for a while now and kind of picked up the pace the last few months, and I hope to keep doing that. And it really helps when we have great guests joining us. And today we certainly have that with Lisa Nisenson with Greater Places in Arlington, Virginia. It's Jane Jacobs week, and I thought, one of the things that Jane Jacobs was really big on is sort of democratizing planning and democratizing how we build our communities. And I think the work Lisa's doing really does that. So really happy to have you on, Lisa. I think this is a great week to have you on. I'm also I'll throw a link in the chat. We did a profile of Lisa recently and talked about some of the work she's doing and kind of her career background, which is really fascinating. So I'll put that link in the chat here, but definitely recommend checking that out. And without further ado, let's get to it. What we'll do is Lisa will give a presentation. She's got a few slides and images she wants to share. We'll open it up to questions, and we should be done sometime between noon and 12:30. So Central Time. I'm in Central Time here, but I'll let you go. I'll let you go ahead, Lisa. Thank you again for being on here.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, and yes, happy Jane Jacobs Week. She has certainly been an icon of mine. I actually got started in urban planning as a civic advocate, fighting a Home Depot. Our neighborhood had to teach ourselves urban planning, and it was back when this guy from Miami named Andreas Dewani was putting out books. And so we honestly learned the elements of a strong economy and what good urbanism and transportation is. My only regret is that we did not have a strong towns around to help us, because we certainly did need to talk about really solid economic planning and streets and stuff like that. So I applaud both strong towns and everyone's work here. So let's just get into the presentation. I hope you enjoy it. We certainly have had an amazing time putting a lot of this stuff together. Let me just see. Actually, let me go to the beginning. Sorry about that. Oops, and sorry about the dogs. This is going to be about game design and game hacks for civic engagement. We're going to look at cards and board games and game night. Just a little bit about us. We are a team of a loose confederation, really, of about 7 people. Sarah Lewis, who's a board member of the Congress for the New Urbanism, couldn't make it today. But she and I actually are part of Greater Places. We're an urban planning tech startup in Washington, D.C. We were just named one of Plan Edison's top 10 urban planning resources. Not unlike Strong Towns has received that designation. We are now working on a mobile app and some new print products. We have a Kickstarter, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well, because that's very helpful to know if you're a civic advocate. And we just stumbled into game design together with a group called Do Tank DC, which is planners, architects, and economic development specialists. And all of us share a passion for democratizing urban planning. So just a little bit about what we're going to cover over the next 45 minutes or so. First of all, we're going to cover simple game design and how to solve problems. We're going to look a little bit about backgrounders of game design and the basics. We're going to look at game hacks that are already out there and how cities are using them. Then we're going to talk a little bit about game design and mechanics, how they relate to cities. And then how can you do it yourself? Now, we're not going to cover video game design or super complex strategy games in this session, or at least not now, but we will talk a little bit about why that is something that's a good next step. So why did we get into games? Well, of course, we can hang out with super fun people who make helmets out of Pokemon cards and do dramatic readings. But a lot of it was just because that's part of our ethic, is to make what we do about communities fun. So much of it has been serious or dominated by technical aspects, and no wonder we have trouble getting people engaged in the mechanics of how their communities work. So we just love being in games. Now you may wonder, hey, we already have board games for cities like Monopoly and Mall Madness. Mall Madness, there are only a couple left. There's one on Amazon now for $89. So if you know somebody who's in retail, get it quick. There are also card games for cities. There's one out there called Flip Cities. I have an asterisk there because it has a great game design behind it, where you flip the different cards and choose and play them, and you iterate up. So there is that incremental development aspect to it. The only problem is that, especially in like the retail category, the thing that sits at the top of the value chain is the shopping mall. So it's not really somebody who knows what they're doing making these cards. We, of course, are best known for Cards Against Urbanity, which started as a joke. If you're not familiar with Cards Against Humanity, it's a game that's sort of like apples to apples, where people take turns judging around, and the person judging throws down a question or a black card, and everyone else looks at their hand of 7, 8, 9 cards and tries to match that black card in a very funny way. We did that for cities. It was a drunk night of playing Cards Against Humanity, but it was so much fun. We were like, why don't we do this for cities? And a year later, Sarah and I were sitting having a beer, and it's like, well, why don't we just do this? So we did it on Kickstarter, and it was very successful, and we raised all the funds we needed in the first 70 hours. And we sent it out to the world, and we thought, you know, it was a party game, and that was that, and we'd go look for consulting jobs and serious planning. But then we started getting reports from all around the country that people were actually using Cards Against Urbanity to teach urban planning. And at first we were very, very proud of that. And then we're like, no, we have a tech startup to do that. And so we started going out to people saying, you know, what is the magic of the Cards Against Urbanity versus our tech startup that we're pouring so much sweat and money and time into? And we were able to actually dive deeper into people's worlds who are on the front lines of building greater places. And they came back with a lot of we were almost like therapists for them, because they were like, oh my God, if I have to give another PowerPoint, I'm going to cry. Or, I'm tired of getting beat up and this is funny. Here's what you should be doing. And so we just gathered all these ideas that we sort of knew in the back of our own minds. But when you go out and you get the information from the people, and from people on the webinar right now, in your own words and your own needs, that really makes a difference. And it was a real eye-opener about our work and how we approach our work. So why are games hot right now? Well, they're hot because video and phone games, of course, have upped the game on games. The second is you've got sites like Kickstarter, which are just really great platforms for getting a game out there and funding it. And in fact, Kickstarter has spawned entire new industries for cards and card games and board games. There are now printing companies that just specialize in things like the games. Pinterest has also given rise to the do-it-yourself game phenomenon, and it's because teachers use Pinterest a lot to share ideas. So you can go on there and see what elementary school and middle school teachers are doing in the game world and hack some of those. At the local level, there's a lot more interest in trivia night and games and board game nights as different bars and restaurants try and differentiate how they bring people through the door. This picture is Robert Moses, and just recently there was a contest. It just closed on April 29th for ideas and for applications, but it was to turn his biography into either a board game or a video game, which is kind of hilarious that people are turning these hefty tomes into fun and play. The second point on why games are hot now, and I cannot impress upon everyone enough, that the trends in participatory planning and open government not only mean that citizens have the ability to come to the planning table and the governing table, but in fact are expected to have some sort of say. And that means you've got a lot of people who are on the sidelines or who felt outside the process, who now actually feel pressure to have a say or come to a meeting or vote on something in the early stages of design. And we now live in a world where, because it was dominated so much by professionals, there's really not any good tools out there. So coming to the public with these complex topics in more accessible ways is critical to having successful open government. And then game design is also creeping into other processes as well, and we'll talk about that. So what is it about game hacking for cities? Well, first of all, it's fun. It's also very portable. You don't have to lug a screen and a PowerPoint projector around. They're relatable, so people can look back to games they know and say, oh, that's how we're doing this. Co-creation is also a big plus when it comes to games, because you can go out and not just have people play a fully delivered game, but actually take part in writing the cards or the questions or coming up with strategies. Incidental learning is probably my favorite, and what we found with Cards Against Urbanity, because what began to happen is you'd get people outside the process who would look at one of the cards, one of the joke cards, and say, why is this funny? And all of a sudden you not only explained why it was funny, but also the learning behind the card. Who was Jane Jacobs? Why is Robert Moses funny? It's like, well, he's not funny. Oh, I get it, haha. And games are cheap. They're so easy to produce these days. You can do it DIY with craft supplies, or even some of these new outlets can print for a fraction of the cost. So let's take a look. So in the tech world, we always open up what we're trying to do by asking what problems need solving. And that's different from going in and saying, oh, we're going to do city planning. And the big question is, well, why? What are we trying to do? And yes, we're trying to make our communities fun and safe and things like that, but it always helps to come at it from that problem solving aspect. And you guys have answered some of these questions, but participants are not informed. They don't know what they want. A lot of people are coming into brand new structures. For example, they're used to a city meeting where they get 2 minutes, but what happens when you walk into a workshop and you're given a piece of paper and you're expected to be the planner? There's a lot of people who come in late to the process. So in these 8-month marathons, you know, if somebody comes in at month 7, you know, a lot of times someone will want to stop the process and wait until they've learned everything up to that point. You get disruptors who want to do that, or people who just have anxiety, and you can't blame them for that. But we don't have good ways to capture people as they come in the door and say, why don't you come over here and let's help you understand, you know, how we got to where we are and what the background is. Those same people, same echo chamber is a problem. People are tired of the same tactics, and I cannot believe how many times I hear the revolt against the visual preference survey and the dot game, because a lot of people feel like by having to vote on a limited set of 7 or 8 pictures that were pre-selected, that they are somehow getting gamed or it's rigged. People are inundated with information. It's very hard to have all of your social feeds and your email and the news and everything like that. And there's no bandwidth left at the end of the day to have a say about whether or not the bridge at the end of the main street should be one way or another. You do get well-organized disruptors, and then there's language and the age barriers. So, you know, look at that menu and give us your thoughts. So let's get into the elements of a game. And I am sure everybody pretty much intuitively knows this, but it's pretty important to go over these pieces as we begin to relate the games and gameplay we already know with the gameplay, so to speak, of how we design our cities. So in elements of a game, you always have player or players. You have information, so the rules of the game or the backgrounder is very important. You have an action. How does the game get played? Do you move forwards? Do you arrange a deck of cards? Something like that. And of course you have a payoff, because that's what keeps the interest level high. Then there's the sub-elements of a game, and this is really important. So if you're gonna have a game that's worth playing, you've got to hit people's motivation. And one of the biggest aspects of motivation, if you've ever played Angry Birds, is competence and mastery, that you get better, that you learn something. And this is totally important for open government, as people come in who are very nervous about not knowing the technical aspects and want to know more. Then there's autonomy, that someone has to know that they have meaningful choices. And a lot of times in planning, you have people walk in the door who think that the DOT has already locked them in, and there are no choices. There's no way to give meaningful comment that will make something better. And finally, you've got relatedness and connections. Can people connect to what's going on in the game or in the city planning? And so these 3 aspects of gameplay relate really well to how we engage people in our communities, with mastery and meaningful choices and the ability to connect. There's also a timing aspect if you're going to introduce games into city design. And there's 4 main ways to do the timing. One is that you create a game for a process, so that when people walk in the door, the game's ready to play. There's that second, co-creation as well. But then there's also timing of, do you play the game at the beginning of the process as an icebreaker or to make people feel comfortable, or do you play the game after the process to blow off steam? And we'll talk a little bit about that. So what are some of these game hacks? And this is the fun part, because we're going to look at games now. There is actually a company in Baltimore that sponsors trivia night for bars, and they get some of these conversations started. And it's really for any audience, but it involves the gaming elements of memory and knowledge, or a timing in the race to be the first to answer the trivia question, and of course to make connections. We are also starting to hack table topics. If you've never seen them, they're gorgeous boxes full of 100 cards that you can use during holiday dinner or just to ask people random questions and start conversations. It's a really fun game to have around. So we wondered what that might look for if you hack it for cities. So you get people as an icebreaker to talk about fun things in the city or in their town. So what's the funniest thing you've ever seen? Or what's the wackiest item on a menu? I love this one. This is from Barcelona in Spain. And as part of a planning process there, they basically created baseball cards, if you will, for places and parks. But they didn't just do the baseball card, they gamified it. And in doing so, they created a map and you had to fill in a sticker that represented each card. And what that did is it made everybody go actually visit the place instead of just swapping cards with somebody who had already run the circuit for you. So it made people go around the town and get to know the place a little bit better. So it had that race element and a mapping and scavenger hunt element. But they also had deck building and then a completion aspect. So if you remember when you were a kid reading library books over the summer and you had to fill it out, it was like, collect them all. But I thought this was an ingenious way to introduce a place to people in front of a planning process. This is really interesting. So in India, the World Resources Institute decided that they were going to turn a boring 200-page PDF into a game. And I don't know about you, but I have been involved in a lot of long, boring guidebooks and PDFs. So this one strikes a chord. So why turn your manual into a game? Well, first and foremost, the taxpayers have already made the investment in the background, so you don't want it just sitting on a shelf. A lot of times these PDFs address very tough decisions in your city or town that involve budget trade-offs or design trade-offs. But the biggest reason is that with your PDFs, you've already got graphics and game rules in place. So for this manual, which is safe access to transit, the game parameters are these different things along the circle, like parking, security, pedestrian, public realm. If we were going to do this here in Arlington, we would also add transit-oriented development because that's our gig here. But as you can see, every community is going to be a little bit different as to what these quote-unquote rules are. And at the end, they just wanted to make sure that everyone was heard and considered. Now, the way they did this is they turned it into a role-playing game. So you were given a manual of someone who was unlike yourself, and you actually had to run through this tabletop exercise. It was more a poster than a board game, but they made it an exercise, and you had to fight for the different design elements for that person you were representing. And so you got to role play, you got to see trade-offs from another person's point of view. So it began to build empathy for some of the other quote-unquote players, instead of having a system where everybody comes up and advocates for their own position. So I thought that was just really brilliant. And then method cards. This is one of the tools that we've been experimenting with. They're used in in web design, and it was begun by web designers who were starting to take on new clients 10, 15 years ago when the web was early. And the florist and the dog groomer, like, they had no idea what web design was. And so the consulting firm IDEO put out these cards that basically had the different elements of game design, and they'd lay them out on a table so that they could talk about these super technical terms with lay people in designing their own site. And so it's sort of like a puzzle as to how do you put together the perfect website, but it also helped the client have a common vocabulary and mastery of different web design techniques that at the time were pretty foreign to everyone. There are actually precedents for method cards for placemaking, and this one is from Italy, and I have no idea what these cards say. But it was for designing a new co-housing project for a range of different people. And again, it was, what are the different things we want this place to be? And then once they would assemble these decks, they could talk about, well, what are the different conflicts or complements that are going on here? And then this is our method card experiment going on right now, where we wanted to take the urban design manual, again, not too exciting, and take it unbound and do the same sort of thing where you could begin to lay cards out on the table with the public in a way that's way more interactive and friendly than a PDF or a PowerPoint or a lecture. The funny thing is, with our card game, we started putting it on the street, and in Kickstarter, it's not doing that well. And most people would be ashamed of that fact, but maybe it's because we have no shame. But people were like, yeah, we like cards, but how do you play this? And people really wanted us to turn it into a game. And so we're working on that right now with how do we let people assemble places using method cards, or how do we gamify this? Because people really love the aspect of games. And then finally, I think this is kind of cool, that you can have game hacks for regulations. And so to the left, this looks like a game board, and it's not an actual game, but in Los Angeles County, they adopted some of the most complex, confusing, and strict stormwater and low impact development regulations you've ever seen about 10 years ago. And there were all sorts of things like triggers and thresholds, and then you had options, and it mattered who you were. So instead of a flow chart, the graphic design department made it into a familiar graphic that people could approach a little more easier, like Candyland, where you're going through a system of a game board. And it was way easier to explain if you had to comply, and if you did, what your choices are. To the right, with the What is Zoning toolkit, that is actually a toolkit that the Center for Urban Pedagogy put together to explain zoning in Brooklyn, because a lot of apartments, this is about 5 years ago, as Brooklyn was becoming gentrified, were becoming, there was a balance. Do we redevelop, or how are we going to do affordable housing? And one of the things they soon realized is that people did not understand what to fight for because they didn't understand zoning. And so they put Legos and footprints and games into a toolkit and sent it out into the world. So at this point, I am going to open it up to questions and see if there's anything in the Q&A.
All right. And I'm not seeing anything in the Q&A. People are being a little shy, but that's fine. I have some questions, Lisa.
Okay.
I really like the part where you talked about the trend toward open government. And I was hoping you could expand upon that some more. I mean, you hear about it a lot, but what are some of the more tangible and good examples you're seeing of the move to open government, and then how gaming is relating to that?
Okay, that's a good question. And the most tangible one I can think of right now is participatory budgeting. And New York City has actually gone in this direction where they're games, and actually Pete Peterson's launched a video game about the national budget as well. But what these participatory budgeting initiatives are doing is they are actually putting the budget in the hands of taxpayers and making taxpayers allocate money, not just based on their own needs, but based on a range of competing interests. And it's intended to have people make the trade-offs and make informed trade-offs before going to the government and saying, well, you ought to cut this program altogether because I don't use it. And instead it becomes a richer conversation where people say, I know the trade-off is X and Y, so let's figure out the budget in this way. So that's one of the best examples out there. I think with open government, you also see a lot of open data that's coming onto the scene. And we're in the early stages, so I don't want to be too grumpy, but a lot of times that data is like, let's hack data for data's sake, instead of you know, let's solve a problem with these different data sets, or what problems can we solve with these data sets? And that's getting into a much more mature conversation. And it's one where some of the hack nights actually are producing games. So if anyone has seen the app or the website Street Mix that lets you rearrange streets and cross section, that's another example of gamifying the street design process. And the guy who created that, his name is Lou Huang. He's in New York City. He ought to get an award, because I can't possibly begin to explain how many citizens are now in the process and making better decisions because they were able to futz around with street widths and how it's designed, where the trees go and stuff like that. So.
Yeah, you know, Lou's work is great. I've used it personally, you know, in my community work here in Grand Forks. And Lou, actually, by the way, people might recognize Lou's work at Strong Towns, because he's helped us with the interactive Black Friday parking maps that we do during Black Friday parking. So he's a great guy. And yep, he's served the urbanist community very well over the years. You know, one thing we didn't, you know, get to at the beginning, but it probably should have touched on some more, because I think it's really fascinating, Lisa, is your kind of evolution into this. You know, you started out, like you said, fighting a Home Depot and winning, by the way. So congratulations on that.
Thank you.
And then you eventually were at the EPA in the Sustainable Communities program, and then you were a planner. So how is that background kind of informed what you're doing now?
So I think it helps to have a foot in all three camps, even though that's anatomically impossible. But it does give you a lot of empathy for the constraints that each of those players is going through. And so I think that, to me, drew me into the game design and that aspect of developing empathy for other people's points of view. So for example, a lot of times as a planner, I got yelled at because of some of the street design, and it was the Florida DOT. And I didn't want to sound like one of those lazy planners who's like, oh, don't yell at me, it's DOT's fault, go away. But rather, you know, I felt like I was on the hook to help the situation get better. So, and now as I'm working in my own community, you know, that same thing happens when there's a lot of local decisions that are constrained, but it's not the local transportation department, it's Virginia DOT. And I think that our community understands that. We're all planning nerds here in Arlington. So a lot of our reaction is we try and mediate these conversations amongst the players where we know everybody has power or a stake. To get to an outcome. But again, I think it's that once you've been able to live a day in someone else's shoes, your decisions get much better. So.
Yeah, and you know, it sounds like that's a big benefit of participatory budgeting work that's being done too, is you really are focused on, you know, being in other people's shoes. You know, I think another trap that, or maybe a negative consequence of some of these meetings that maybe turns people off is, you know, a lot of times when we're talking about planning and you know, improving our communities, it's really easy to focus on what's wrong and kind of get negative really quick, because, you know, we want to make it better. So it's like, well, that's inadequate, or that's not working, or and though, you know, it's important to do that, but you can fall into the trap. I've noticed, you know, sometimes in some of the community involvement work I've done, where everybody focuses so much on the negative that we forget the reasons that we actually like our neighborhood or we like our community. How does the gaming help us stay away from the negativity? Because it seems like it brings a fun factor, and that could really help with that.
Well, there's part of that. And then I think if we just put tools in people's hands where they can design their own city or their own street in a way that's fun, you know, you get straight to, you know, how do we put together these pieces? And I think that's the other thing that appealed to us about method cards, because if you think of it, the conceit of suburbia was that you don't have choice. You have a pre-selected hand of cards, and that hand of cards, the retail always looks the same. You know, it's a strip mall. The housing always looks the same. It's a subdivision or an apartment complex. The streets all are designed the same. And for us, with the method cards, we want to start to give the various design options to people and let them kind of play around with assembling a deck. Because at the end of the day, great places, you know, aren't one card or even cards, so to speak, from one deck. They're across decks. So the economic development and the street design and the retail and the housing and the policy all fit together. And it's great to have cards because you can shuffle in and out and kind of experiment both mentally and physically. Like, what would happen if, you know, instead of doing the public meeting this way, we did it this way? And you just start to let people consider options in ways that they haven't before.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You know, I think well, actually, before I get to my next question, people are being shy today, but there is a question mark icon. Should be on the bottom. If you roll your cursor over the screen, you'll see a question mark icon, and feel free to ask a question, or you can put it in the chat window too. Certainly, if anyone has any questions, good time to ask them. Another one that came up, Lisa, as you were giving your presentation that I found interesting. You mentioned, you know, some of these PDFs and some of these comp plans, and actually using those to create games. And, you know, it sounds like a great way to solve that problem of these things getting dusty on a shelf. Can you talk a little bit more about that? And I'm particularly interested in, you know, have you found some communities that have done that real effectively that we could look at?
So in researching for this presentation, some of them weren't ready for prime time yet, but the number of cities that are looking into this is growing. And people are interested in making game boards. I did actually hear that Arlington itself, I didn't even know about this, last year had a participatory budget game going on. And so it is catching on. I don't have any, I tried to include everything I heard about in this presentation.
Sure. So, well, and it sounds like it's really emerging too.
Right.
I know I've been hearing and trying to plant the seed a little bit too. I'll send a follow-up email, by the way, folks, with a link to the video of this webcast, and I'll include some other links. And one of them I want to include, and I know, Lisa, you have a DIY link for Cards Against Urbanity, so I'll include that. I actually just sent one of our members in Indianapolis a link to that, and you know, because he wants to start getting people together in his community, but he was looking for stuff to do, and they don't have a specific issue or agenda yet. He just wants to have some local people to talk with. So they're doing kind of an urbanism on tap thing, and one of the first things they're going to do is Cards Against Urbanity. And I thought, you know, what a great idea and a great way to get people together, and also like a low pressure way. You know, people don't feel there's a huge agenda or they have to do anything. They can just show up and actually talk about these things in person with people, and sometimes that's good enough, at least to start things out.
And actually in the second half of the presentation, or the second third, I have a couple of examples of that. So someone asked if I was familiar with MetroQuest, and I am not. So I'm dying to look it up to see if their gaming methods are complementary. I'm tempted to go there, but I probably need to run through the rest of the examples, if that's okay.
All right, yeah, let's get back to it.
Are we ready?
Let's
do it. All right,
so
I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint. Here we go. So game mechanics for cities, and this is a little wonky, and I apologize, but these are the different ways that games are set up, and some of the best games actually do several at once. And we've talked about role playing and how that builds the empathy, deck building and how you build strategic combinations, area, movement, and control, which planners are accused of doing all the time. Cooperative play is stakeholder interaction, where you try and get people to play nice with each other. Pandemic is a card game that has a lot of cooperative play, not that cities are like epidemics, but maybe they are. Economy management, these are big. There are games called Pick Up and Deliver. One of the most popular ones is called Indonesia, but it's where you set up transportation and logistics. I wonder if anybody has done that for drones yet.
Hey, Lisa, really quick, I'm having trouble seeing your screen.
Oh, okay.
Oh, there we go.
Oh,
great.
Can you see it now? Because I put
No,
stop
now
sharing.
I can't.
Okay, you cannot?
Not right now.
Okay, let me try this again. So.
You just had it for a second there, so.
All right, sorry about that.
No, no worries.
How's that?
There we go.
Is that good?
Yes.
Okay. So getting started and some of the research that you need to do, look at your audience and who they are. Is it kids? Is it adults? Are you doing training with your engineering staff? Then think about your needs and your goals, and yours as the person developing the game, but also the player goals. So if you're working with the public that's somewhat skeptical, crawl inside their head and try and imagine, or even ask them, you know, what do you want out of this process? What are their constraints in meeting the full potential? Is it lack of political will? Is it that they just don't have enough information or background? Preferred playing styles. You could do solo, cooperation. You can put people in competition with each other and see what happens. Who are they playing with? That's sort of like audience. What interactions do they enjoy? So for some people, they love the complex and the competition, but other people may not feel comfortable with that. So, you know, a simple board game may be the best. And then the last one's most important. What metrics do players care about? Because they are, after all, playing to have mastery and meaningful interactions. So, you know, if you're setting up a board game about a new street design and everybody's concerned about cars speeding, then, you know, just make sure that you are keyed into that in your game design. So let's look at a couple of game mechanics. So Candyland, everybody's played. I hate Candyland because my sisters and I were so competitive, and it always ended in tears and blood, and it was terrible. So it's kind of ironic that I'm in this now. So you have a board or a path, and it's usually driven by luck or by chance, which people who are anxious or maybe not extroverts, you know, it's a little easier and more comfortable. They're graphically simple, and the fun drives the game. So for a city hack, you can see this is good for something point A to point B, like a commute game. It's also a way to describe the regulatory process, as we said earlier, and to build vocabulary. So Candyland is based on colors, but you could just as easily have the game movement driven like Chutes and Ladders, perhaps, with actual text. There are also simple card games, and so the evil part of me wants to do like the city version of Super Fight, which is the card game in black and white where you throw down a roll and then you throw down 2 superpowers. And it's just a quick way. Again, it's simple. It's an icebreaker or a steam blower offer. But just a funny way to get people joking around about some of the city design mechanics. And then you can also do things like develop cards for placemaking matches, like what can you put next to each other. So there are probably people on this webinar who are familiar with Catan, which is Settlers of Catan, which is called a European board game. They're heavier on strategy. They have resource constraints, but there's also ways to mitigate bad luck. So in Candyland or some of those other games, if you have a bad roll of the dice, too bad. But in these games, you can work on strategy and cards so that if you hit a dead end or something bad happens, you can actually work around that. And that's, you know, exactly how cities work. So there's a lot of appeal to actually building more complex card games with this sort of mechanism. Players are expected to collaborate or compete, and you know, the city hack could be to mimic complex processes for training or resource allocation or build out. And I think this is for Sarah and I, this is our next direction. This will look familiar. So for a game lab we did at New Partners for Smart Growth, instead of Chutes and Ladders, we did streetcars and stroads. And people loved it. Again, you roll the dice and you just advance. But for the game board, we actually had cards and things written in, so that if you landed on a space, on some of the other spaces, it would explain something like vision 0. So you'd go forward. And we had a couple of people who came up and they're like, what's vision 0? And so we were able to explain to them it's the goal of pedestrian and bicyclist safety. And they were like, oh, that's what that is. They're doing it in my town. So all of a sudden we had people learning the concepts and the vocabulary with a silly game based on rolling the dice and moving forwards. We did this for $10. So the hardest part is that we got game boards that were 18 inches by 18 inches. So you can't do that off your home computer. We had to go to Kinko's or an engineering office. But again, it's a very simple way if your planning office is willing to print these out to build a board game. For our next stop, we are going to Railvolution in October in San Francisco, and we were approached to come up with Transit-Oriented Development, the board game. And we think we're going to hack Trivial Pursuit. So we started off with the intermodal transfer station, but again, it's that idea that you have these various categories that you have to put together, and we're going to figure out how to make it cooperative gameplay. So that people are forced to collaborate with each other, or people are forced to come up with different funding pots, just like transit-oriented development. But it's a way to teach people the complexities of building around transit and all the moving parts and all the actors and all the regulations. So this one's going to be fun. So, of course, this is called Exploding Kittens, and it's like, what if you reimagine Exploding Kittens as Exploding Public Meeting? So how would that work? Well, Exploding Kittens is there's a deck that's packed with kitten cards, and if you draw the kitten card, you have to explode, and you're out of the game. However, there are other cards in the deck that can diffuse the kitten blowing up, and so that deck also has strategy cards that can lessen the chance of drawing the kitten card. So it's like, how do exploding meetings work? Well, it's stocked with well-organized opposition. We'll call them woo. Unless you know how to handle woo. So in a lot of ways, it's like the exploding kitten. And then facilitators actually have strategies to lessen the chance of the exploding meeting. And so for Sarah and I, it's like, how do we develop Exploding Kittens that teaches people about different tricks for facilitating meetings, both preparation before, but also if you're in the middle of a meeting and it's starting to go south, you know, how can you gamify and teach these different concepts to people as the meeting progresses. So just as a recap, let's revisit some of those problems again. And it's that participants aren't informed. And some of the game aspects are actually building skills and mastery for vocabulary and concepts. And some of that can be card, some of that can be board game. Going into new structures. So a lot of ways you can design games that actually help people understand the process or the regulations. People coming in late to the process, games can provide you a way to siphon people off to a side and give them method cards or give them a game board or vocabulary cards where they can come up to speed really quickly. The same old people, well, of course, with games, you attract new comers to the process. And in fact, we held this same seminar 2 weeks ago at MIT. And some of the ideas that came up is that you might be able to get parents to a meeting if the kids can play a game. But if you make that game also about the city, then all of a sudden you get 2 members of the household, not just one. People are tired of the same tactics. Well, games are definitely not the usual tactic. People inundated with information. Well, cards and games allow you to give little simple snapshots of information so people can go at their own pace with these little digestible bits of game pieces and game directions. With disruptors, well, I'm not ever sure we could ever solve that one completely. It'd be nice like in Exploding Kittens, if you could draw the laser pointer card and distract them. But I think a lot of times just having people who are better informed about the background and the process helps to alleviate some of that. And then if you can teach facilitation skills and actually bring everyone in the meeting up to speed so that everyone is actually aware of the disruption and that they are part of the solution for getting the meeting back on track. And then language and age barriers, a lot of this is super visual. So people can talk that language of images or show, and that is where the preference surveys that are visual do have some utility. But gamifying that or putting the game creation and the visual preference creation in the hands of the community can help give you a broader array of things that people want to know. So what's next for us? We are actually going to go into card design as part of how we do consulting and do custom cards. If you're in the Kickstarter, we've got a mobile app, and we've decided to pull that out, and because we found out we could build it ourselves for $600 and didn't need to raise $20,000. So let's get back to the, I saw there were some questions and answers, so I hope that was useful and fun, and I'd love to hear other people's ideas on their involvement in games. So
absolutely. And really quickly, so I did see Rick in the comments asked about he's like, I'm sold on Cards Against Urbanity. Can I buy a pack or
yeah, we'll include how to do that in the follow-up email.
Okay, great. And I did include a link to the DIY version too, so if people want that.
Oh, good.
Yep.
Good.
Okay.
And, so the young professionals in transportation are actually now doing a global expansion pack in time for the ITE conference, the Institute for Transportation Engineers, I forget, in Anaheim in August, and they are hilarious. So they're under the same rules we are for the Creative Commons license, that they can't sell it. They can recoup costs, but they can't sell it for profit, and they have to make the PDF free. So yeah, we're gonna cover every aspect of cities with those cards. So excuse me, there is a question here. From my perspective, planning should really be a process, whereas government is oriented towards scheduling and budgetary needs. How do you reconcile these differences? I find that defining the problem to be solved is not necessarily obvious. Can stakeholder input help in this phase? Oh my gosh, absolutely. And one of the things that we did not cover here was this idea that part of the gamification is crowdsourcing and crowd resourcing. There's an interesting experiment going on in Spain right now with a group called City Mart, and it has to do with procurement and improving procurement. And what City Mart has started to do, okay, in the United States, when you're procuring a service or a good, you have to go through this process. And for planning, for procurement, we as planners typically have to write out what the problem is and spec out the solution in the same document. So it's almost like, why bother asking a consultant what to do if we have to do all this, and the lawyers are making us like figure out exactly what the deliverables are so we don't get screwed. Excuse me. What is happening now with some of these crowd resourcing prospects are that for procurement, they're actually doing issue for the problem statement that goes out, and it goes out to the public and it goes out to potential consultants. So that you only do the first half first, because if you don't state the problem correctly, it's almost impossible to spec out the solution properly. So yes, exactly. That's a great question, because I think that we're going in the direction of opening up that first part of the process for consultants and the public alike.
Right.
So I hope that was helpful.
Do you I was going to ask, getting back to Cards Against Urbanity, do you have a list or know it sounds like there's a lot of groups around the country that are playing it pretty regularly. Do you know of any?
Right.
I know there's a bunch of people at CNU last year in Dallas that were playing it, which was really fun.
Right. If you go on Twitter and just search Cards Against Urbanity, so last week in upstate New York, there was the Landscape Architects game night. And then the Young Professionals in Transportation, the Nerd Train, there's a group of people who ride around on Amtrak and play cards. This is brilliant. So Catherine Hartley of the American Planning, no, CNU or APA, I forget which one, in Florida. She printed out several copies for the APA Florida conference, but instead of giving everybody a full deck, she only gave a partial deck, and she sized it so that there weren't enough cards for just 2 people to play. And it was intended as an icebreaker to get 3 or 4 people to have to come together to have a big enough pile of cards to play the game. And I thought that was
Nice.
brilliant. And so that's another way that you can use cards to actually force that. And one of the things that we're actually going to do for a conference coming up in the fall is to gamify the name badge. And it's a placemaking conference. And so I think what we're going to do is include stickers or cards or something like that, where you have to go find people with complimentary cards to make a place. But it makes you go meet people you otherwise wouldn't approach. So there's that aspect as well.
That's brilliant. Yeah, and something so simple, right? You already have that. You may as well use it. And conferences can always use anything to help liven them up a little bit.
Right. So anyway, that's about all I have right now.
Okay. So great. Well, this is actually, I think, about perfect. We're at the top of the hour. This gives people a chance to, I think some people are probably on their lunch break or maybe took an early lunch, and this is a chance to to get back to work. And but really appreciate. We will send a follow-up email. We'll have a link to the recording, and then we'll have some of the links we talked about during the webcast today too. So there'll be some good resources for people. I'll have a survey in there as well, so please fill that out. Definitely like people's feedback. And Lisa, thank you so much for doing this and for imparting all this wisdom and just really hard-won experience. You've been, you guys have been working hard on these games and trying trials and different trials to get things perfect. And that's I think another key part of this is, you've taken a very kind of entrepreneurial approach where, you try something, if it doesn't quite work, you adapt it and you tweak it. And that sounds like that's
and that's what games
process.
Yeah, games let you do that in a way that a formal planning process, because a lot of times if, meeting 3, the meeting blows up, you're done. And people don't trust the process or what you were trying to get across. But, if you make it into a game and it doesn't quite fit, people are like, that was just a game.
Yeah. So. Yeah, that's a great point. All right. Well, thank you so much, Lisa. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. Really appreciate it. And look for an email and have a great day. Thank you.
All right. And Lisa. This MetroQuest looks awesome. So thanks.
Nice. Yes. Take care, everyone.
I learned something. Awesome.
Bye.